The snowstorm raged outside, its icy winds battering the walls of Jack's cabin. Inside, the retired firefighter sat in his living room, the glow of the fireplace casting flickering shadows across the room. The blizzard had isolated him for days, and the silence was only broken by the occasional crack of the logs in the fire. Then a sound pierced the stillness, a faint, desperate scratching. Jack frowned, setting down his mug of coffee. He listened carefully. There it was again, this time accompanied by a muffled whimper. His heart began to race. The sound was coming from the front door. Walking cautiously toward the entrance, Jack's eyes widened as he approached the glass door. There, framed against the swirling snow, stood a German shepherd. Her body trembled from the cold, and pressed tightly against her were two tiny puppies, barely visible beneath her protective stance. Frost clung to her fur, and her breath came out in visible puffs as she gazed at Jack with eyes full of desperation. Jack hesitated, his hand hovering over the doorknob. He knew opening the door could mean bringing trouble into his home, but as her gaze met his, something deep within him stirred. The decision he was about to make would change their lives forever. Jack's heart pounded as he stood frozen in front of the door. The storm raged behind the trembling German shepherd, her breath fogging up the frosted glass. Her body was hunched over, shielding the two tiny pups that clung to her side. Their small bodies were almost buried under the snow accumulating around them. Jack could see her ribs pressing through her fur, her coat matted with ice. Her eyes, pleading and filled with a mix of fear and hope, locked onto his. "What the hell happened to you?" Jack whispered to himself, his breath misting in the cold air inside the room. Instinctively, he reached for the doorknob. The moment the door creaked open, the icy wind surged into the cabin, carrying the storm's unforgiving chill. The German shepherd didn't move, her paws still planted firmly in the snow. She remained frozen in place, her gaze fixed on Jack, as if unsure whether to trust him. "Come on, girl, get in here," Jack coaxed, crouching down to make himself less intimidating. "You'll freeze to death out there." The dog let out a soft whimper, glancing briefly at her pups before stepping forward. Her movements were slow and cautious. She nudged one of the pups with her nose, urging it to follow. The smaller of the two stumbled in the snow, its tiny legs struggling to keep up. Without hesitation, the mother gently picked it up by the scruff and carried it inside, followed closely by the second pup. As soon as they were inside, Jack shut the door behind them, blocking out the storm's relentless roar. The sudden warmth of the cabin caused the German shepherd to tremble more violently, her body adjusting to the temperature shift. Jack grabbed an old blanket from the couch and gently draped it over her and the pups. She flinched at first, but when she realized he wasn't going to harm her, she let out a long, shaky sigh and lay down near the fire, curling protectively around her puppies. Jack knelt beside her, his mind racing. The pups were tiny, their eyes barely open, and so frail that he could see their little chests rise and fall with labored breaths. He reached out to touch one, but the mother's low growl stopped him. It wasn't aggressive, just a warning, a reminder that she was still wary of him. All right, Jack murmured, raising his hands in surrender. "I get it. You're a good mom. You've been through hell, haven't you?" He stood and grabbed a bowl from the kitchen, filling it with warm water. Placing it near the dog, he stepped back, giving her space. She eyed him warily, but eventually leaned forward, lapping at the water as her pups huddled closer to her side. Jack watched from a distance, his thoughts swirling. Where had she come from? How had she ended up in the middle of a blizzard with two newborns? Her condition suggested she had been on her own for a while, long enough to grow weak and desperate, but not enough to give up. The fact that she had made it this far, carrying her pups through the storm, was nothing short of a miracle. But now what? Jack wasn't prepared for this. He had always been a dog lover, but his life had taken a quieter turn in retirement. He hadn't had a pet in years, and the idea of caring for 3 dogs especially ones in such dire need, was overwhelming. Still, as he looked at the mother's exhausted frame and the way she curled protectively around her pups, he knew he couldn't turn them away. "You've got a fighter's spirit, I'll give you that," Jack said softly. "Guess that makes two of us." As the night wore on, Jack worked to make them more comfortable. He laid out towels for the pups, placed a bowl of food near the mother, and stoked the fire to keep the room warm. The German shepherd watched him closely, her eyes tracking his every move. But as the hours passed, her posture began to relax. For the first time, she let her head rest on the blanket, her eyes fluttering shut. Jack sat in his chair, the fire crackling softly beside him, and couldn't help but feel a strange sense of purpose. He had no idea what tomorrow would bring, but for now he had done what he could. And as the storm raged on outside, he made a silent promise to the mother and her pups. They were safe, and he wouldn't let anything happen to them. Jack couldn't hide the grin spreading across his face. "Well, aren't you full of surprises today?" he chuckled, kneeling to scratch behind Grace's ears. She leaned into him, her tail wagging more enthusiastically now. Snow and Ash barked happily, circling around his legs in excitement. As their bond grew stronger, Jack began to wonder about Grace's past. Where had she come from? What had led her to his door that snowy night? The questions lingered in his mind, but he knew one thing for certain. Whatever her story was, it was one of survival and resilience. Grace had faced the worst of circumstances and had emerged with her pups by her side. She was a fighter, through and through. That night, as they all settled by the fire, Jack looked at Grace and spoke softly. "I don't know where you came from, girl, but I'm glad you found me. You and these little ones, you're part of the family now." Grace lifted her head, her eyes meeting his. There was something in her gaze, a quiet understanding, a bond that needed no words. She let out a soft sigh and rested her head on his lap, her body completely at ease for the first time since she'd arrived. Jack felt a lump rise in his throat as he stroked her fur. He hadn't expected this, the arrival of a stray dog and her pups to change his life so profoundly. But as he sat there, surrounded by the warmth of the fire and the soft sounds of Grace and her pups, he realized that they had given him something he hadn't even known he was missing: companionship, purpose, and a renewed sense of hope. Chapter 4. Shadows of the Past. The morning sun filtered through the cabin's windows, casting golden beams across the floor where Snow and Ash playfully tumbled over one another. Grace lay nearby, her eyes half closed as she rested, but her ears perked at every small sound. Jack, standing by the kitchen counter, sipped his coffee and watched them with a sense of contentment he hadn't felt in years. But as peaceful as things seemed, a lingering question gnawed at the edges of Jack's mind. Where had Grace come from? She bore the signs of a hard life: her thin frame, the faint scars along her coat, the cautious way she moved when startled. Someone had failed her, and Jack couldn't shake the feeling that whoever it was might still be out there. That afternoon, Jack decided to take Grace and the pups outside. The snow had begun to melt, revealing patches of frozen ground beneath. Grace stepped cautiously onto the porch, sniffing the air as if testing for danger. The pups, still unsteady on their feet, followed close behind, yipping excitedly as they explored the new world beyond the cabin. Jack smiled, watching them. "You're safe now, girl," he said softly. "Nothing's going to hurt you here." But as they ventured a little farther from the cabin, Grace suddenly froze. Her ears shot up, her body tensing as her nose pointed toward the edge of the woods. Jack followed her gaze, his own body stiffening. "What is it?" he asked, stepping closer to her. Grace let out a low growl, her hackles rising. Jack squinted into the trees, but he saw nothing. Still, the way Grace's body was positioned, protective, ready to defend, told him everything he needed to know. Something was out there. He quickly gathered the pups, cradling them in his arms as he guided Grace back toward the cabin. Once inside, He locked the door and pulled the curtain shut, his heart racing. Grace continued to pace by the window, her eyes darting toward the woods. Later that evening, as Jack sat by the fire, he couldn't shake the unease that had settled over him. Grace lay nearby, her pups nestled against her side. But she remained alert, her eyes flicking toward the door at every sound. Jack reached out and gently scratched behind her ears. "You're not just being paranoid, are you?" he murmured. "You've seen something like this before." His thoughts wandered as he stared into the flames. He couldn't imagine what Grace had been through to make her so wary. Had she been abandoned? Hurt? Jack clenched his fists at the thought. Whoever had done this to her had no right to call themselves human. The next day, Jack decided to get answers. He loaded Grace and the pups into his truck and drove into town. The local animal shelter was small but well run, staffed by volunteers who knew most of the animals in the area. Jack approached the front desk, carrying a photo he had taken of Grace and her pups. "I found her outside my cabin," he explained to the receptionist, a kind-looking woman in her 40s, named Sarah. "I was wondering if anyone's reported her missing, or if you recognize her." Sarah studied the photo for a moment before shaking her head. "I don't recognize her," she said. "But dogs like her, we see them more often than we'd like. A lot of breeders out here keep dogs in terrible conditions. When they're no longer useful, they just abandon them." Jack felt a surge of anger boil within him. "You mean to tell me she was probably dumped?" Sarah nodded solemnly. "It happens more than you think, but she's lucky she found you." The drive back to the cabin was heavy with silence. Jack couldn't stop thinking about what Sarah had said. Grace had been discarded, thrown away like she didn't matter. But she did matter, to her pups, to him. And now he was determined to make sure she never felt unwanted again. When they arrived home, Grace stepped out of the truck and immediately began sniffing the air, her tail wagging slightly. Snow and Ash followed, their little legs working hard to keep up. Jack watched them, his heart swelling with both anger and hope. "You're safe now," he said firmly, looking at Grace. "No one's ever going to hurt you again." Grace turned to him, her amber eyes softening. For the first time, Jack felt that she truly understood what he was saying, and in that moment he made a silent vow. Whoever had hurt her would never get the chance to do it again. If this story touched your heart, let it inspire you to take action. Consider adopting, supporting a local shelter, or simply sharing this story to spread awareness. Together we can make a difference, one rescue at a time. Thank you for being part of this journey.